4 years old that were recognizably the object that they were supposed to be. I remember over lunch we talked about this, and actually I remember drawing a picture of a lighthouse when I was a 4-year-old that actually looked like a lighthouse. But I think I've over-answered your question, so
No.
shoot another one at me.
Okay. What's your first film you remember?
First film that I remember. Well, I'm absolutely certain it's not the first film I ever saw. But the first film that I remember was Rocket Ship XM. I was 4 years old. My father had been, at one point in his life, been working as an aeronautical and he was fascinated with this idea of going to the moon. He kind of dragged the whole family out to see this. It was in Yonkers, New York. And I remember sitting in the theater, being bored to death because I couldn't follow the story.
Not many people did.
Right. But I do remember looking at this thing on the screen and pointing to it and asking my father what it was, and he kept saying it's a rocket ship. And at that age 4, I probably barely knew what an airplane was. It was a different time. There weren't that many people who traveled by air and so forth. And maybe I saw an airplane in the sky or something like that. But the novelty of the spaceship was really kind of interesting and riveting to me. But also they had a giveaway. After you left the theater, the fellow at the ticket booth gave my brother, I have a brother who's 3 years older than I am, and my brother and I, these printed images on chipboard. And what it was a tongue and groove, fold out, punch out rocket ship. And it was printed in orange and blue. You know, back in those days they used to have these giveaways. And you're probably too young to know this, but some of the older folks might remember the Gordon masks that were given away with Dave Yearson still. It was advertising the whole life-size head of Gordon that with a rubber band you could attach to your head and would scare the hell out of your neighbors. So the idea of getting the spaceship was a pretty neat thing, and I remember cutting it out. You were supposed to be able to punch it out. There were so few punches that you would tear it. So we took a pair of shears and cut them out. And we made these 2 spaceships, one for my brother and one for myself. And I remember playing with it. I remember the ink rubbing off on my hands and infiltrating my bloodstream. I think that's what got me hooked.
Well, that sounds like the films got to you. When did you pick up on reading this stuff? And we'll get to art.
I remember reading, when I was in elementary school, I remember reading a story called Young Visitors to Mars. And there was an alien creature that was a red, white, and blue striped artwork. It looked like an artwork, but it had red, white, and blue stripes on it. And so they called it Yank. But
Original.
That was my first memory of reading science fiction. I think I started to read science fiction mainly in paperback form, because in the late 40s and early 50s they started publishing many of the stories in anthologies.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember reading Van Vought's Voyage of the Space People as a little kid.
Fix-ups. Okay, and well, let's start getting into the art. The covers grab you, or was it subject matter?
Well,
so,
the subject matter was reflected, which was important. But it was a combination of both. But initially, I remember that some of, my brother had been a big influence on me too. He eventually became a chemist, and was very much interested in science, and loved science fiction. He was the one who encouraged me to read science fiction. I remember he traded with an older fellow, say maybe an 18-year-old, a box of paperback books.
mm-hmm.
And so I started reading Van Vogt and Del Rey and Highmark in these paperback form. But originally, the language, and particularly the scientific terms, were beyond me. So what I would do is I would line up the covers and I would try to imagine what the stories were about. So the idea of creating the visual narrative was kind of an instinctive thing.
Did you, lining up books like that, did you incorporate them into a story, visuals into one
Yeah.
story?
Yeah.
So you had a mixed visual smorgasbord that turns into a completely different story. Make it up in your head.
Yeah, and I am willing to bet, if you look back at the genesis of Star Wars, and I've said this in depositions relating to the Star Wars lawsuits that were pursued, that George Lucas had this evening that he spent with Francis Ford Coppola. Coppola had financed his first feature-length film, which was an expanded version of THX, which became THX 1138. They were talking about what he might do next. And, at that point, he had gotten funding to make American Graffiti, and that kind of touched a popular nerve at the time that it came out, and especially the soundtrack. I think for many of us who were in that generation, it really spoke to us in terms of what high school life was like and what the fantasy of adulthood meant to us. And so the film kind of tapped into the popular.
It was a bit of a fantasy image of high school life.
Well, absolutely, absolutely, because there was never a blonde in a T-bird in any high school I ever went to. But anyway, to make a long story short, supposedly while he and Coppola were trying to find something to see in movies, they lamented about how the movie serials were no longer with us. These chapter plays were absolutely wonderful. I know that I encountered the movie serials really through early television. They were about 15 minutes long, and they could run 2 episodes in a half-hour time slot. A lot of early television was only 15 minutes anyway.
Sure.
I remember
Flash Gordon.
Right.
It's one of the biggies.
And I remember Flash Gordon, seeing Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers and many of those early serials on television. So they were lamenting how these episodic adventures, which always ended at the edge of a cliff, which would have what we call cliffhangers, were no longer with us. And that really became the basic formula that Lucas applied to the Indiana Jones movies. I mean, it starts off in the middle of a story, right?
Lucas?
Yeah, well, Spielberg directed, but Lucas wrote, co-wrote, and produced.
Yes, that's true.
So the Indiana Jones movies were very much based on movie serials. And that kind of energy also permeates Star Wars. The very first, the movie that was later called Star Wars: A New Hope, begins with this stream of text veering off in perspective, which is lifted right out of Flash Gordon Conquers the Universe. At any rate, what I think happened was, at the end of the evening, Lucas was inspired to want to create something that would be evocative of the course. And I honestly think that he went to the bookstore the following day, or the day after, or the day after that, and started buying issues of Analog and started buying issues of the science fiction books that were being published by Ballantine at the time, and just line them up, because the whole iconography of Star Wars is incorporated in that period from 1975, when he had that evening with Coppola, to 1977 when Star Wars was released. If you look at and you arrange them in a certain way, that they actually are almost the complete storyboards of the original film.
So can you remember any specific images that you think are incorporated?
Oh, many. Well, the most obvious one is the Chewbacca character. It's lifted from a John Shomier illustration called For George R. R. Martin's story, an early George R. R. Martin story called In 7 Times Never Kill Man. As a matter of fact, in one deposition written by Joe Johnston, now a movie director, in those days an illustrator who was doing concept work on the film, he said, I remember the day that George Lucas came into my office waving this issue of Analog in the air, saying to me, I want you to trace the interior illustrations for Ralph McQuarrie from this story. so there it was in black and white, this admission that they had ripped them off. I asked Jack about it later, Jack Sherman. Jack, are you going to sue him? And Jack said, I can't adopt it. So he never did anything. But there was this open admission that that's where it came from. But if you really look at those things, the images were written from John Berkey and from Chris Foss, and to a lesser extent from me, but there were, I remember going to a screening with a bunch of science fiction illustrators. It just practically swallowing my tongue because it was like looking at our work up on the screen.
It would have been a great audience to sit there and listen to the comments.
Well, most of it was pretty disparaging.